They did not just dislike you. They built an entire empire to bring you down. Hear this clearly. The person you once thought was simply not a good match, someone who just felt a little off or uncomfortable around you, was never an ordinary adversary. This was a narcissist who quietly built an entire empire against you. They did not just dislike you. They wanted you erased from their world. They wanted your life completely dismantled. They wanted your image ruined of everyone around you. They wanted every connection, every form of support, every relationship you had to be cut off one by one. They wanted you pushed out of the very position, the very life you worked for and rightfully earned. And they did all of this with intention, with cold precision, and with calculated subtlety. They watched you like prey in the dark. They studied your weaknesses, your emotional wounds, even your strengths, looking for ways to turn them into weapons against you. They chose the right moment, the right words, the right actions to strike where it would hurt the most. Everything was planned. A small piece of gossip here, a quiet manipulation there, a moment of false concern, just to gather information. And then using that very information to isolate you, exhaust you, and push you toward despair. In their mind, you were nothing more than an obstacle. Small, weak, replaceable. They believed this without question. They told themselves, in one form or another, sooner or later, they will disappear. No one is going to stand for them. If I stay consistent long enough, dirty enough, ruthless enough, they will fade on their own. They played this game for a long time, silently, carefully, with a deep sense of control. They built their empire on the idea of your collapse. Every lie told behind your back, every fake smile in your presence. Every moment they played, the victim was another brick in the structure they believed would secure their power. But now something has changed. They are panicking because the one they thought would break has not broken. Because the wall they built to bury you is starting to crack in visible ways. Because what they did in the dark is now being brought into the light. And they know it. They know that the moment you see the full truth, the moment you stand up without confusion, the moment you are no longer silent, that is the moment everything turns. Justice is not distant. It is happening now. Everything they set in motion against you is beginning to return to them. And what is breaking them is not you. It is the realization that this time they are no longer in control. You are not the victim anymore. You are the one who endured. And now you are standing. Watching the collapse of an empire they spent years building just to destroy you. They are afraid, and they have every reason to be. They wanted to take your place, not just defeat you. This is a critical point. Pay close attention, because this is the key to understanding the true, distorted nature of the narcissist who oppressed you. They did not just want you to lose. They did not just want you to suffer or disappear. They wanted to replace you entirely. They wanted to take your place in the eyes of others. They wanted your presence to fade until no one even remembered you had ever been there. They wanted you erased from the story so they could step into your position, as if they had always belonged there. They craved what you built. They craved the respect you earned. They craved the admiration people gave you. They craved the genuine relationships you carried. And they were willing to do whatever it took to take it all. That is why they did not stop at attacking you. They began constructing a counterfeit version of you. They pretended to be kind, offering warm smiles, gentle words, and carefully timed concern. They pretended to be sincere, telling stories that made it seem as if they had suffered in the same ways, as if they carried the same depth. They pretended to be moral, condemning wrongdoing while secretly doing far worse behind the scenes. They pretended to be pure, creating the image of someone flawless and beyond reproach. They pretended to be mature, acting wise, thoughtful, and grounded. But it was all a performance. They had no real depth, no authentic character, no genuine heart, no moral foundation to stand on. They were wearing an identity that was never theirs, a distorted, shallow imitation of who you are. Every word they spoke, every action they displayed was a clumsy imitation of what they had observed in you. This was not just oppression. This was identity theft at a deeper level. They wanted to take the essence of your story. They wanted your place in your family, your workplace, your circle, your community. They wanted others to look at them and believe they were the one who mattered. They wanted you to fade into the background while they stood at the center. They wanted the narrative rewritten. You as the problem. They as the victim turned hero. They wanted the future to belong to them with every opportunity, every connection, every form of recognition that should have been yours. This is why they did not stop. This is why they could maintain the act for so long. Because what drove them was not simple dislike. It was greed. They wanted your identity. They wanted your life. They wanted to become you without ever paying the cost of what it took to be you. But this is also where they fail. Because a counterfeit cannot hold forever, no matter how convincing it appears. It cannot sustain what it does not truly possess. The mask eventually cracks, and when it does, the collapse is severe. Because once people begin to see the difference between the original and the imitation, between depth and performance, between a real heart and an empty one, everything changes. They do not just lose the position they tried to steal. They lose the image they built through deception. They are exposed fully, without protection, without disguise. And you, the one they tried to replace, remain, not diminished, not erased, but intact, real, and stronger than before. You do not have to pretend. You are the original. You are the one who carried the weight, who lived the truth, who earned what you have. And when they see you standing again, when they see people beginning to recognize what is real, they feel the position they took starting to shake, they do not just panic, they are terrified. Because they are forced to face the truth they cannot escape. They may have taken your place for a time, but they could never become you. And now that truth is breaking them from the inside. This is justice, not just that you rise again, but that you return to your rightful place while everything false about them is stripped away. You were meant to live in truth. They were never built to sustain it. They used lies, gossip, manipulation, and other people as weapons. They did not win by truth. They gained ground for a time by distortion. Nothing they built against you was rooted in what was real. It was shaped through lies that sounded convincing, stories that felt believable, and narratives repeated often enough to settle into people's minds as if they were facts. They twisted what happened. They left out what would have cleared you. They added what was never there. And they did it with intention. They planted doubt where there had once been certainty. They introduced questions where there had once been trust. They allowed rumors to move in spaces where you were not present to correct them. They did not need everyone to believe them. They only needed enough people to hesitate, because hesitation weakens perception, and weakened perception creates distance. In some cases, they went further. They spoke about you in ways meant to diminish you. They used language designed to humiliate you without appearing openly hostile. They attached labels to you that did not belong to you, knowing that once repeated, those labels could begin to define how others saw you. They shaped a version of you that did not exist, and they presented it as if it were truth. And the most dangerous part was this: they did not act alone. They worked through others. They pulled in people who trusted them. They influenced those who were easily led. They relied on those who only heard one side and never thought to question it. They allowed others to carry what they started, creating layers between themselves and the damage being done. So when the narrative spread, it no longer looked like it came from one source. It appeared reinforced, echoed, confirmed by multiple voices. And that gave it weight. They wanted your entire environment to shift against you. They wanted people to look at you differently, to question your character, to doubt your intentions, to distance themselves without fully understanding why. Because if they could alter how you were seen, they could weaken everything connected to you. Your credibility would suffer. Your trust would erode. Your position would become unstable. Your relationships would begin to strain. That was the strategy. Not a single blow, but sustained pressure from multiple directions. But the structure they built carried a flaw from the beginning. It was not grounded in truth. It depended on manipulation. It depended on controlling perception. It depended on keeping certain realities hidden while amplifying what was false. And that kind of structure requires constant maintenance. Every lie must be supported by another lie. Every distortion must be protected from contradiction. Every person involved must remain aligned, whether knowingly or not. That is not stability. That is tension. Because truth does not need reinforcement to remain consistent, but falsehood does. And over time, the strain begins to show. Stories stop aligning. Details begin to conflict. People start noticing what does not add up. And when that shift begins, it does not stop where it started. It spreads. Because once one piece is questioned, the rest is no longer secure. What they used as weapons begins to lose its force. What they relied on to control perception begins to turn unstable. And the same environment they shaped to work against you begins to move in ways they can no longer direct. This is where everything changes. Not suddenly, but undeniably. Because what was built on darkness cannot hold when light begins to reach it. And what they set in motion through manipulation is now approaching a point where it can no longer be contained. They became too confident, and that is where the collapse began. Their greatest mistake was not simply what they did. Their greatest mistake was believing they would never be seen. They crossed a line in their own mind where caution was no longer necessary. What began as calculated movement turned into certainty. What was once controlled became unchecked. They started to trust the very illusion they had created. Confidence turned into arrogance. Arrogance turned into exposure. They believed they were in control. They believed their position was secure. They believed the image they built was strong enough to carry them indefinitely. And because of that belief, they stopped watching themselves. They thought no one knew. They thought no one would ever speak. They thought no one had the strength to push back. They thought the game they were playing was invisible. That assumption is what broke them. Because when someone believes they cannot be seen, they begin to reveal more than they intend. They speak too freely. They act too boldly. They push too far. The restraint that once protected them disappears. And that is when the cracks begin. They say things that do not align. They react in ways that do not match the image they tried to maintain. They show flashes of the very traits they worked so hard to hide. The bitterness comes through. The hostility surfaces. The manipulation becomes easier to recognize. And the more they try to correct it, the worse it becomes. Because now they are not just maintaining an image. They are trying to repair something that is already breaking. They attempt to prove they are good, but the effort itself exposes the performance. They try to reinforce their position, but the force they use reveals the insecurity behind it. They try to regain control, but the urgency shows that control is already slipping. The mask they wore for so long begins to fracture. Not all at once, but in visible ways, in tone, in timing, in contradiction. And once those fractures appear, they cannot be hidden again. People begin to notice. Not everything at once, but enough. Enough to question. Enough to hesitate. Enough to step back and look more closely. This is where the shift begins. Not because someone decided to expose them, but because they exposed themselves through excess, through overconfidence, through the belief that they were untouchable. And this is why their collapse did not start outside of them. It started within them. It started the moment they believed their own illusion. It started the moment they stopped being careful. It started the moment they went too far. What they built could have lasted longer if they had remained restrained. But they did not. They pushed. They insisted. They overreached. And now everything they tried to keep hidden is beginning to surface through the very actions they believed would protect them. If you have seen this pattern before, if you recognize how quickly arrogance turns into exposure, type 77. Because this is the moment where everything begins to turn. And once it starts, it does not go back. It moves forward toward a point they never prepared for, toward a reality they can no longer control. The truth came out, and their real face could no longer hide. There comes a point when what has been hidden no longer remains contained. And that point has now been reached. What they did to you did not disappear simply because it was kept out of sight. It did not dissolve over time or lose its weight, because it was buried beneath silence and manipulation. It remained intact. And now it is being brought forward in a way that can no longer be controlled or suppressed. The truth is no longer confined to the background. It has moved into the open, where it can be seen, examined, and understood without distortion. What they said about you is no longer accepted without question. What they accused you of is no longer taken at face value. The version of reality they worked so hard to construct is no longer holding together under scrutiny. Separation has begun. What is false is beginning to detach from what is real. The stories they told no longer align when placed side by side with the facts. The accusations they relied on lose their force when looked at closely. The distortions that once seemed convincing begin to collapse under the weight of their own inconsistency. What they used as weapons against you is now revealing them. The false narratives they repeated, the manipulative framing they depended on, the performance of being the victim that gave them sympathy and protection, the calculated efforts to position themselves where you once stood. All of it is becoming visible, not as isolated incidents, but as a clear and undeniable pattern. And once a pattern is recognized, it cannot be dismissed. People begin to see what they overlooked before. They begin to understand that the kindness was not genuine, the integrity they claimed was not real, and that the image they presented was something constructed rather than something lived. What once appeared convincing now appears inconsistent. What once seemed credible now appears staged. The identity they created for themselves no longer carries authority. It loses its ability to influence because it is no longer believed. What is being revealed is not a misunderstanding that can be clarified. It is a contradiction that cannot be resolved. What they claim to be no longer matches what they have shown themselves to be. And this is where everything changes. Once truth steps forward, illusion cannot sustain itself. The foundation they built begins to collapse because it was never anchored in anything real. Their position in the eyes of others shifts, not gradually, but clearly. They are no longer seen as trustworthy. They are no longer seen as sincere. They are no longer viewed as someone whose words carry weight. Instead, what becomes visible is what they tried to keep hidden all along. A pattern of manipulation, a pattern of deception, a pattern of calculated behavior designed to control perception. They are no longer recognized for what they claimed. They are recognized for what they are. At the same time, something equally significant begins to take place. Your name begins to clear. Not because you fought for it, not because you forced people to see differently, but because truth has a way of aligning on its own once it is allowed to surface. The things said about you begin to lose their strength. The doubts that were placed around you begin to dissolve. The image that was distorted begins to return to its original form. People begin to see you as you have always been, not as they were told to see you. What was taken from you begins to come back. Your credibility, your respect, your clarity. And this is what makes this moment final. There is no longer space for confusion. There is no longer a reason for hesitation. There is no longer a narrative strong enough to protect them or to sustain what they created. There is no room left for doubt or reinterpretation. The possibility of misunderstanding is gone. The need to question what is true has been removed because the truth is now fully established. And once it is established, it does not reverse. They have no place left to hide behind the image they created. The role they played cannot be maintained because it has been seen through in its entirety. This is not a partial exposure that can be repaired or redirected. This is complete visibility. What they are is now clear, and what you are is no longer in question. The truth has moved fully into the open, and it is not going back. The people they used turned against them, and everything started being taken away. This is the point where the reversal is no longer subtle, no longer deniable, and no longer something that can be explained away as coincidence or misunderstanding. What once moved quietly in their favor now begins to move against them with equal force. And the shift does not come from outside pressure, but from within the very structure they built. The people they depended on begin to change position. Those who once listened without question, who stood near them, who carried fragments of their narrative as if it were truth, no longer respond the same way. The alignment they relied on begins to weaken. not through confrontation, but through recognition. Those who were influenced start to see what they were part of. Those who were guided begin to reassess what they accepted. Those who were used as extensions of their reach begin to step back from what they once reinforced. And in many cases, the shift becomes even more decisive. The same individuals who defended them, who justified their behavior, who gave them credibility when it mattered most, become the first to recognize the pattern that has now been exposed. They begin to see the contradictions, the inconsistencies, the manipulation that once went unnoticed. And once that clarity takes hold, loyalty cannot remain because no one continues to support what they now understand to be false. This is not a forced collapse. It is a natural withdrawal. What they built through others begins to turn, not through confrontation, but through awareness. The same voices that once carried their narrative no longer sustain it. The same access they relied on begins to close. The same presence they once held begins to diminish, not gradually, but clearly. And this is where the loss becomes undeniable. It does not happen in a single moment, but in a sequence that moves forward without interruption. Their reputation begins to collapse under the weight of what is now visible. Their credibility fades because it is no longer believed. Their influence shrinks because it is no longer trusted. What once appeared stable in their external life begins to shift as well. Opportunities that once came easily begin to disappear. Support systems that once held them in place begin to withdraw. Resources they depended on begin to tighten in ways they cannot control or reverse. Their position is no longer secure because what held it together was never rooted in truth. It was sustained by perception, and once perception changes, everything connected to it begins to move. This is where the loss becomes real, not internal, not imagined, not temporary. They feel it in the way they are received. They notice it in the change of tone, in the absence of support, in the distance that now exists where there was once alignment. What they relied on is no longer there, and it is not returning, because what is being taken from them is not random. It is everything that was sustained by what has now been exposed. One piece at a time, it is removed. The authority they presented begins to dissolve because it no longer carries weight. The people who reinforce their image step away because they no longer believe in it. The mask they depended on no longer produces the response it once did. The identity they constructed begins to collapse under the pressure of reality, and what remains is instability. They cannot recreate what they lost because the conditions that allowed it no longer exist. They cannot rebuild the same structure because the foundation it depended on has been removed. What once gave them position, access, and influence is no longer available to them. This is what it feels like when everything begins to slip, not all at once, but continuously.